Now, I don't know, a lot of people are not familiar with this, but the clothing business in Baltimore was the #1 business from the Civil War all the way up through the Second World War.
We are basically looking at a city that grew up around industry, and industry grew up around the port. There were numerous industries that came and went long before I did. I was born in '42 during the war. Well, obviously, Baltimore was very important during the war.
As a matter of fact, also, a lot of things people don't know is we were also making uniforms for the South in the Confederacy. The South would send their cotton up here to be woven in their mills here and up in Maine, and we would make uniforms for the Confederacy. And since Maryland was kind of a divided state, not in the war, but as far as in the sympathy, it didn't seem to bother too many people there. But in any event, after the war, the German Jewish immigrants that came in were responsible basically for the clothing business as it is today.
We were in an era where we had a very segregated Jewish society. There were the German Jews and there were the Russian Jews. That's the way it was in those days. And the German Jews were the highfalutin, business-oriented, upper-class Jewish population that populated Utah Place and that whole area.
At the Hospitality Company, all the cutters, well, we worked on one floor. And then the floor below us, the trimmers worked. They did all the trimming. And then below that, you had the sewers. And they put it together. Mostly women, no children when I started.
Were there any women?
There's
no women cutters.
That was forbidden. It was a man's world. Today it's different, but I know for a fact back at that time there were no women cutters.
It was very labor intensive, and the people really worked hard. Can you imagine sitting 8 hours at a sewing machine or at a pressing machine or whatever?
No.
They were all skilled in what they did. I mean, they were as skilled as a doctor, a lawyer, or a bricklayer. It was a skill, and they learned the skill, and they were very good at what they did. And to make a men's sport coat or suit coat, amazing amount of machinery and engineering went into it.
In the beginning, I had my shears, I had a tape measure, I had a 18-inch rule, and I had a weight that I would set on the pattern to hold it in place while I marked it. And I had a tape measure around my neck all the time because, you know, we had to measure inseams, length of the sleeves, and all that stuff was different, and you had to measure and make the alterations.
Basically, as far as memory is concerned, if I can,
He started out as a tailor. That's his job when he came over to this country. And he educated himself the best way he could. He took night classes. But since he had talent and drive, he learned as much about making a men's suit as possible in Philadelphia. And then there he got himself up to what was known as a clothing designer. Now, a clothing designer was hired help most of the time, but they also had the skill to sit down on a piece of paper or on a planter, draw out a concept of what a suit should look like, and then break it down into all the parts that are needed to make that suit. You had to cut the sleeves, you had to cut the backs, and all of these had to be joined properly when it went through the shop. And he had the ability to grade them up and down to 38, 36, 37, and 42, 40, and he had to make it into longs and shorts. This was done on a mathematical basis, but he could supervise these patterns being made. And you had to make a pattern, because when you put it out on a cutting floor and you spread the cloth,
usually they'd have two men, they'd have a roll of material through a pipe on the end of the table. A man on each side of the table would pull the cloth down, go back and get the other piece of cloth and pull it down. They may turn it over, but the spreading machine did away with a man. We put some machines in, and they were threatening the man that ran the cutting floor, probably the people that owned the company. They were trying to protect their job. The union was fighting the machinery because one man could do the job where before it took. The machines did come in, and there was nobody got hurt or anything. Just threats.
But he could supervise these patterns being made. And you had to make a pattern, because when you put it out on a cutting floor and you spread the cloth, the cutter, who was a higher grade employee, would have to lay this down, chalk around it, and then cut it out with a revolving knife, either by hand, if it was a single or multiple, by a reciprocating blade. And this took a lot of skill, because you were dealing with $10 a yard, $5 a yard, depending upon the cloth. And this might be 10 high or something like that. You had to be very careful that you cut the parts out accurately, so when it went into the sewing shop, it could be sewed accurately. So if you had a linear progression of responsibility, they were the sewers, the pressers, and those people actually worked in the shop. Then you had the cutters, and they had a separate union, and they were sort of an elite in the union because they had this special skill, and they always had a higher earning capacity. And then you had my father, who was a clothing designer. Now, a clothing designer, a lot of times, was a hired help. He had paid a yearly salary. Well, when S. Ginsburg and the Sons was first starting out, and they heard his reputation, they couldn't just hire him on a yearly salary. He said, "I've already got that," and he demanded to be part of the business. So what they did was began to entice him in there. They gave him a share and made him a partner in the business. So he used his skill to get into ownership. And once he got into ownership, then he was on an entirely different social level than the cutters. But he still, because of his old memories of it, they respected him. All of them respected him highly, because he could tell them what to do, and if they didn't do it, he could do it right and show them how to do it. And also on the sewing floor, if it wasn't sewn right, he could sit down at the machine and sew it right. So when you can do that, of course, you earn the respect of the people under you. I think you can follow that.
So anyhow, the first day there, I didn't have any shears. Somebody in the company loaned me a pair of theirs, and they started me out chopping small parts, like pockets. I would do pockets, I would do flies, waistbands on material that wasn't usable for anything else. So anyhow, I learned how to chop. It took several weeks. I wound up with blisters on my thumb and inside my index finger, big blisters, and they popped, and I had to keep doing it. And finally I got calluses after a while, and it didn't bother me. When I got proficient, then they put me on piecework. The scale at that time was like $130 a week, and you couldn't make over 130 a week. In other words, if you were on piecework and by Thursday you had reached 130, then you slowed down or didn't do anything on Friday. You just sat on your table, because if you did over, the shop chairman took whatever you made over $130 and he put it in a kitty. And he went around to everybody payday to make sure that they didn't go over the $130. And if they did, he took it, because you were only allowed to make $130. That was it. You had to put your time in. You had to put 40 hours in to get to $130.
People worked. It seemed to be the Italians, a lot of Italians were in the business, the Jewish, and then the Asians came in, and they really took over. Without the Asians, I think business wouldn't have survived as long as it did. It's a change. It's a perfect business for immigrants, because they don't have to speak the language. They were
were two major immigration laws passed in the United States in the 20th century. The first one was passed in 1924, which effectively ended major immigration into the United States. And that was the law of the land through most of the 20th century. It was in many ways a racist immigration law because it really only cut off immigration for those from Southern and Eastern Europe who were looked down upon racially at the time, and continued to allow white Anglo-Saxon Protestants to come in at a pretty good clip. So by the 1960s, there are extraordinary demands to change U.S. immigration policy. And in 1965, Lyndon Baines Johnson passes a landmark immigration bill, which dramatically changes the way that immigration is handled in the United States. It allows in new immigrants from developing nations, especially in Asia. So you have spikes in immigration from Asian workers as well as Latin American workers who, under prior legislation, were not allowed to work in the United States. So a lot of the immigrants that are coming over in the late 1960s through today tend to get the kind of work that is available.
I came to Baltimore in 1955. And I started to work for Glen Haven Limited. They were manufacturers of ladies' suits with the slogan, Glen Haven suits you.
Why was it that it was men's clothing that predominated over women's?
Because women didn't work, didn't dress up, except the ladies of means.
Who were you selling to?
Sell all over the United States, exclusively to certain stores. Like for instance, in Baltimore was Hochschild Coat that the only one could buy from us. At the end, I was the assistant to the owner, from a clerk.
Can you explain?
Who didn't speak English either.
From Poland, in '55.
Yes, I used to live in the Bronx.
And this is in 1950.
51.
51.
Till 1955.
Were there similarities between the New York, the way you saw things in New York, and then when you came to Baltimore?
No.
Very different?
Different. The pace was a lower pace.
Slower pace in Baltimore?
Yes.
Pace of the work?
The pace, yeah.
Oh, it was, you never stopped. Our tables were like 44 yards long. That's almost half the distance of a football field. And we walked up and down these tables all day long for 8 hours. That's what you did. But as far as doing piecework and time work, I'll take the time work anytime. Piecework was a killer. It was a killer to me because I didn't stay at it long enough to really become proficient. And these guys that I was working with, I'm going to say 80% of them were Jewish guys who had been there for years. They were fast and they were good and it came easy to them. Had I stayed there maybe 4 or 5 years, I'd have been as good as they were. But it takes a long time to learn those skills and to do it proficiently. So to me, it was always a hassle. I'd much rather been on time work and not have the pressure. Because, you know, when you're on time work, you know you do what you're going to do, what you get paid for. And on piecework, you do what you do, and a lot of times it's not enough. I think they did it because they could get more out of a guy. You know, he would work harder and get more done if he was on piecework than if he was on time work. And it only makes sense. If you can push a little harder to make more money, hell, you're going to do it.
Got to the point where I'd gotten married and I wasn't making any money and things are pretty tight, and not only for me, for everybody. And just wanted to get into something that was a little more demanding. I thought it would be more profitable. So a friend of mine his father had a clothing factory called Modern Manufacturing Company. And it was a little sweatshop. So I told him I was interested in learning the sewing trade. And they had a mechanic who got ill and they needed somebody real bad. So they said, well, I'll come in there and learn the trade and help them at the same time. And that's what I did. And there I went to another factory called Cohen & Goldman on Asquith Street. That was a big factory. It was Cohen & Goldman, and Botany 500 eventually bought them out. But there were two mechanics over there that I became friends with. And they were teaching me as I was working at this other plant. They needed sewing machine mechanics real bad at the time, and they were desperate for someone that had some knowledge of sewing equipment. Just happened to hit it right. And I wasn't making any money, but I was learning fast. And first thing you know, I stayed with that company for about 40 years. As a mechanic, if you you carried any weight. In other words, if you could handle the job, they just felt like they didn't need no help. I was pretty well taken care of. It was a steady job, steady pay. I never lost any income on being sick or anything like that. There was a steady job, steady income, which is all I was really interested in. There was about 400 machines there. There's always something there. Those days never come around. There was always something to do. Electrical work, a little bit of plumbing work, running airlines, moving equipment around. It's always something. Always. The girls all mostly on piecework, and there was a little problem there because a lot of the girls, when the machines were down, they weren't making any money, and they wanted a mechanic as soon as they hired for a mechanic company. They had a big office here in Baltimore before they moved south. That was back in 1950, 51, 52. They had a group of mechanics. Some were specialized in certain machines, certain models, and I got friendly with those guys, and they taught me a lot. When I would be in a jam, of course, I was just learning. I didn't know too much, and I had to get some outside help. So when I would call the center company for the certain model machines that we had there, every time a mechanic would come in, I stuck my nose in the way, and I picked up things and made friends with them guys, and they were willing to teach me anything they knew, and that's how I got going with those guys. I got along with all of them. I had to do because they kept a lot of stuff to themselves. Matter of fact, there was one incident where one of the supplier salesmen told me that he heard that they, on a roundabout way, that they didn't want so many guys coming in there teaching me too much about that equipment because they wanted to keep it to themselves.
In those days, men's clothing, they acted like it was a military secret, each factory. They didn't want any other factory to get their secrets or to get something up on them.
Were you one who would wear a hat and a tie all the time?
No. I would start off wearing a tie, but as things moved on, I was in more of a sports shirt and khaki pants. More as it got into the 70s, 80s, and 90s. I mean, there were some mechanics at different companies that wore ties all the time. That was their dress code. Singer and Union Special and the Reese Company made buttonhole machines. It slacked off as it became more informal.
But in those days, everybody wore a tie. When I first started, we had to wear a tie, even lower management. 1972 or 3, when I was working for American Golfer, everybody wore a tie. And one day I decided it was hot, the factory wasn't air conditioned, I wasn't wearing a tie. And I came to work without a tie and khaki pants. I thought the place was going to go into a revolt. My boss accepted it, everybody else did not accept it. It was chaos with a lower management. I was still a young guy, and I had so many people in the industry who were the old timers that everything was a tradition. You did everything by the books, the way they wanted it. You didn't ask questions, you just did what you were told.
And again, you're coming to Baltimore from where?
Philadelphia.
Philadelphia. And you came by yourself?
Yep, came by myself. Didn't know a soul. I needed a job. And I got a job here. When I first came to Baltimore, there were 5 stories here. And the blouse company had 4 floors. And this was the first air-conditioned factory in Baltimore. This Henry Kramer started, and he wanted people. Air conditioning first came out, and he put it in this building. First 3 floors were air conditioned. I worked in the cutting department on the 3rd floor when I started. And I'd go into the alley and see where the fabric used to come in, and we used to have to unload it with a small elevator, take it upstairs, examine every roll of fabric, put it on the cutting, give it to the cutters. It was a union shop, and at the time there were about 175 employees. One of the things that I remember about this, there were steps leading and there was windows here for the offices. And during the riots, they came down here and they shot bullets into the windows. So I was on the 2nd floor and I called my boss, and he was in New York. I said, we got a problem here. And he said, no, just keep, in those days you just kept working. There was no stopping to do anything. He says, no, keep working. And the next thing we had National Guard standing on the steps with rifles, but no bullets, just rifles. And then they threw a brick through the window, and I said, I think this is time to go. So we left, and it was a mess in this area. One of the things also about this building, when I left this place, I went to American Golfer, which was on Greenmount Avenue. It's not a great area. And then I left that place, and then I started my own company on the same floor as when I came to Baltimore.
Is that right?
12 years later. They took the elevator out. The elevator was right here. Because this was not apartments at the time. This was, the bottom floor was a machine shop. Dashu. They were in business 100 years. We used to come out here and go up, pick our parts up, come right back down, go right up the elevator, buy a machine. It was a binding company where Ace, I can't remember the name of the company. But they were in this building, so everything was here. There were Shank Buttons was on the corner. All these were manufacturers. Everybody here. There was a company on the 5th floor, Schrader Tie.
In terms of unions,
it was a very big part of the garment industry. A good thing when it came. It was over on Packer Street, where I can remember some of the first quote-unquote sweatshops. And the union came in and said, okay, you can't do this. You can't work 60 hours a week. You had to have certain facilities. And at that, for those things, it was a good thing. I mean, I can't remember a week where I didn't work almost 50 hours a week. Never.
I know unions are important and they serve a certain purpose and they are very good for what they do, but all circumstances are different. Sometimes unions are necessary. Sometimes employees will be better off without a union. Unions can't get everything. If management's not willing to give in, what good's a union? But the job of the union is to get it. And they've been very successful in the past unions. My hat goes off to them.
Back then, everybody wore hats. The unusual thing was to see a man without a hat. So there were more hat stores, there were more hat cleaners, there was more everything related to hats. Here's the hat we're talking about. Where is it? I saw a whole bunch of those yesterday. Oh, throw it out the window there. There's one in the window. What's this hat? It's a Panama hat. This is a hand-woven hat. It took 20 hours to make this. Too cheap. It's only $115. The tradition was at the close of the ball game on opening day, the men would destroy their old hats and throw the pieces on the ground onto the ball field, and then run out to the hat stores and buy new ones. That was a tradition. That was May 15th. That's when the games. Excuse me. That was the ball games.
How about
I
start?
never witnessed it.
Oh, you
No,
never?
but, it's hat history. Baltimore was the capital of the world for making that style. It was the capital of the world. So they all came from Baltimore, mostly from Baltimore Street. Mostly from Baltimore Street. So,
I think it's always been the immigrants who are the most vulnerable. And they come to this country for many different reasons. And Baltimore was an enormous point. Locust Point was the second largest point of immigration after Ellis Island. So workers would come in by the tens of thousands to Locust Point.
It was a time when we had a class society. You know, the African Americans waited. They weren't even allowed to wait on people yet. You know, all the clerks were white. People were dressed nicely. There was a great authoritarian type environment. And to be quite honest with you, it was an era that those who had money lived well, and those who didn't have money, some of them lived well because they were supported in order to support these people. But it was, wasn't that long after the slave era. I don't think that slavery ended in the 1860s.
The most neglected part of American history is labor history and workers' history. And it's a socially controversial because when people read their history, and I often have said that when I get discouraged, you talk to people who are religious, when they get discouraged, they read the Bible. When I get discouraged, I read labor history because it shows the inspirational stories of people like the clothing workers in Baltimore.
I got discouraged a couple times learning this trade. I was about to quit. And his uncle, Ben, who passed away first, he was the oldest one, I think, of the three brothers. He was a hell of a nice guy. He says, you're not going anywhere. If you need any help, you'll get it. Don't go nowhere. You stay where you're at, and you're doing good. And he encouraged me and everything. And different things. If I needed something, whatever it might be, he was there for me. He was one hell of a nice man. I was in there a couple of years, and I said, I ain't getting nowhere. I was getting frustrated. It was a lot of machines, and I was all by myself. And I was maybe I did the wrong thing. You know, when you get pissed off, you start looking around. But it worked out good.
Give you one last story now that you mentioned London Fog. I was in business December of 1976, beginning of December. I was sitting on a Friday night working, didn't know where I was going to get work on Monday, had a little bit of work, had $47 in my checking account, and London Fog called and offered me a position to run all 3 factories for them. And I turned it down. I said, I got $47, I'm going for broke. I couldn't quit what I was doing.
Things do come down to the economics. If people don't have enough to live, they're going to resist, and they're going to rebel. And unionization is one way that they can channel that sort of animosity about economic inequality and the lack of opportunity. There are limitations to what a union can do, but the truth is that unions have been the most successful force of progressive politics in the economy in the 20th century, hands down. Progressive America owes its existence and legislation to the union movement. Unions are as necessary as ever. Will a new movement emerge that looks like the old union movement? Who knows? But one of the things that made unions so strong in the 20th century was that they were dynamic, that they could change to meet the demands of workers, and they could change as organizations. And the future, people are always going to care about economics, and they're always going to band together in order to affect change in the economic realm. What form it takes? Who knows?
I think without the union, we never would have gotten a raise. We never would have gotten paid holidays or vacations or anything. I firmly believe that. And as it was, the vacation you got, every house in the city closed down July 1st, and you were off for 2 weeks. Whether you wanted to or not, that was your vacation. So if you're going to plan a vacation, you plan it for those 2 weeks in July. And then while I was there, I don't know what year it was, they gave us the week between Christmas and New Year's. So we wound up with 3 weeks vacation. Well, we all thought that was a great deal.
It's a perfect business for immigrants because they don't have to speak the language.
And they could work, they could pay them a little less.
If they could. They never overpaid. My father always said, even with unions and so forth, the workers never, I would say, never were paid what they maybe should have been paid. They were never really well compensated. And a lot of times they would open another factory somewhere and start non-union and pay the people 60% of what they were paying the old people. That happened too. Like my father said, after the Second World War, companies started to move down south. The South would maybe give them a building or give them tax-free for so many years. Plus they would have the labor and they would have no union. So they started to move down south, down to North Carolina. My father set up pressing stuff. Hold a minute.